you emphasize light a lot. And when someone listens to you on the internet, it's very easy to think that you dismiss nutrition. But from listening to you for a while, I think your message to the food gurus is that it's not just about food, and food doesn't work without light. Uh, to me, I see them both as pillars of health. I see light as extremely important, and I see nutrition as extremely important. What's your relationship to these two? So, do
Yeah,
you?
it's pretty simple. To answer your question, um, it's actually more fundamental than even you just phrased it. Let me explain to you what the real problem with food gurus are. Let me explain to you what the problem with your perspective is. It's your perspective. Food is light. That's where it should stop. It should hard stop for you right there. Nothing about food that you believe is true. Why? Because everything you believe about food is from the macronutrient perspective, and food isn't about macronutrients. Food is about light. Food is an electromagnetic barcode of the relationship of where the earth is to the sun. And you will never understand quantum biology until you get that perspective. So the reason that I'm really hard on food gurus, the reason I will be hard on you and the rest of this podcast is if you don't bend to my will. And the way I will force you to bend to my will is I will continue to tell you time and time again, tell me where all food comes from. It comes from the photosynthetic webs. So tell me how your perspective is right in any universe, because it's not.
I was
So,
going. I was going. Sorry, I was going to ask you about that because
well,
I think the perspective that you do have is that food is light. So when you say that light is important, aren't you automatically saying that nutrition is important too? But you're viewing
yeah,
it from
I
a,
am, but I'm saying it below and in between the words. Why? Because if I say it the way you want me to say it, you're going to make the mistake that you continue to make. And
okay.
the problem is the food gurus are wrong about food. They have absolutely no idea how food fundamentally works in the mitochondria. They have absolutely no idea why food really matters. And it turns out certain foods are more important than others. And it turns out the location of the foods actually is critically important um, in terms of building health span. For example, you're not a guy who is optimized to the 59th latitude. You are built for a completely different world. Your existence in this podcast right now is proof positive that we have enough fat built into our system that a guy who's built for a subtropical environment can exist in the tundra. Okay. Now, that doesn't mean it's the wisest choice to make forever and ever and ever. It just shows you how adaptable life can be. Um, the key for most people is that the in total environment has been really switched around now. No longer is the environment controlled by nature. Now the environment is controlled by man. The fact that you can get on a plane and leave your ancient homeland and go live in Stockholm is proof positive that's the case. The problem is, man has also done the same thing with food. And the problem is, your mitochondria yet have still not adapted to that issue. They adapted to our migration, our ability to fly, our ability to travel on boats, our ability to move across the tectonic plates. That's where the haplotype story came from about 70,000 years ago in Homo sapiens. Prior to that, pretty much everybody was a coupled haplotype from L0 to L3. Those were the people that lived between the 20s. Um, Once you begin to understand this perspective, that's when everything changes.
I know you've said that the mitochondria are environmental sensors, so to speak. And so when you eat food that isn't local, your mitochondria think that you're somewhere where you aren't. So could you
Correct.
could you talk about the importance of food locality? Because I know that that's something
It's
you
critically
really.
important. It's critically important. If you get it wrong, you can actually eat healthy foods and get sick. And this is very counterintuitive to the food guru perspective. It's extremely counterintuitive to the centralized medicine perspective. But guess what? Any person out there with a metabolic condition will tell you it's axiomatically true. Why? Because when they restrict their calories, eat foods that people tell them they're healthy, they still wind up being sick. And the problem is the centralized perspective, the perspective that you want to sell me in the beginning of this podcast, that food matters more than light, is the reason why they keep making this mistake. So when I said this the first time 20 years ago, of course, I've been mocked all the way through. And then all of a sudden, about 5 or 6 years ago, papers started to come out and they said, this is really interesting that food seems to have a specific linkage to latitude. And it turns out that things that we currently thought were healthy turn out not to be healthy when you eat them and can still lead to metabolic disease. Now, I believe in the next 10 or 15 years, this is going to be continue to be teased out, in the literature. And then people will begin to understand food gurus are going to have to adapt. Biochemists are certainly going to have to adapt because the biochemist mindset is calories in, calories out. Exercise is key. And all that matters is macronutrients. That is the paradigm that's gotten fucking people completely wrong. And that's the reason why that advice hasn't reversed any diseases. The key is a lot of times it's institutionalized people with some of these chronic diseases. Why? Because the nuance of understanding that food is light is the key to opening the door to the paradigm that I'm bringing to you. So let me give you a really big example that should blow everybody's mind who listens to this podcast, because I really haven't talked about it too much on other podcasts. Most people know my work from way back in the day when I got into fights in the paleo community with a guy named Ron Rosedale, who is a big proponent of fat burning. At the Paleo FX conference in 2011, when I was a keynote speaker, I actually told people in the paleo community that if you don't see the sunrise every day, you can't fat burn. So I want you to think about that for a minute, meaning that your TCA cycle requires AM sunlight in order for it to spin counterclockwise, because remember, the TCA cycle is connected to the inner mitochondrial membrane. So when you tell people what Rosedale did, and you don't explain to them why it's a big issue, and a guy like me comes along and I'm the first one that gives this advice, there's now papers literally 10, 12 years later after this fight that show that I was dead right. In fact, one of the biggest mitochondrial researchers in the world now, Nick Lane, has been out there telling people literally for the last 3 years, this is in fact true. Several guys who've blocked me on Twitter have posted pictures and saying, Jack Kruse has been saying this. And it turns out it's now published in the literature. So it's no longer conspiracy theory. Okay. And this is the thing that you'll find out why your perspective is so queer to me. Why ever would you think of food the way you think of it? I think that is the holistic way of doing it. That is the pseudoscientific way of looking at it. And I'm going to continue to call your perspective pseudoscientific. Why? Because every day in the literature, I get smarter and smarter and smarter. And you look more ignorant by the day. And I am going to continue to point it out until you bend your knee and you say, I didn't think about food like this, so you made a mistake. And when you do that mea culpa, I promise you, I'll welcome you back to the tribe. If you want to see one of the guys that's done it and has gotten absolutely flamed on the internet, it's Paul Saladino. He wrote a book, became a millionaire, about the carnivore diet. And what did he do? He moves to Costa Rica and says, you know what? Adding honey and fruits is probably not a bad gig. Guess what? Paul's right. He's absolutely correct. But the way in which he sold the message to the people who he sold the first message to, which is the people who you believe, that led to his flaming. And the problem is you as a teacher, because remember what the name surgeon means in Latin. We are teachers. We have a duty to teach the public the truth. And remember what the truth is. It's an approximation of the things that we have found to be true as data changes. Well, the things that you and your ilk, because I am painting you with this brush now, you've decided to paint me, so I'm going to paint you right back. I'm going to tell you that when you paint people with that brush, I am going to pin you down and hold you down, open your eyes with my fingers, and make you look at what you missed. But once you see what you missed, I'm done really messing with you. It's kind of like a cat playing with a mouse. And I think I've done that with a lot of podcasters. I mean, Max Goulhane, who's a doctor from Australia, I got into it with him. I did 3 podcasts with him in a row and proved to him that it was about light. He's come around. He's not so much the perspective he had anymore. And I think the reason why I'm persistent about this is because I know that this is the biggest mistake that centralized healthcare is making for people. In the United States, we have 250 new diet books a year. And just by chance alone, if you do that over the last 125 years, you would think that we would have fallen on the right prescription at some time for chronic disease. But yet, over the same time frame, from 1893 all the way to now, chronic disease has done nothing but grow. So it tells you, the data is screaming to you, it is not about food. So why do you keep saying it? Because you believe the lie? Well, that's exactly the reason why people rolled their sleeves up to get the jabs, or why people decided to use the other medication for COVID that the FDA just admitted didn't work. The bottom line is you have to call bullshit out when you see bullshit. And this whole story about food is absolutely complete bullshit because of the perspective that we have with food. And you need to understand that nuance. That's the nuance that I don't think you're getting. And I think in the beginning of this podcast, you're trying to make me more palatable for your crowd, probably your perspective. And Uncle Jack's not going to do that. I
Well,
never will.
I mean, that's why I'm talking to you, because I know that many people overemphasize nutrition. Me personally, I wouldn't call myself a food guru. I would say that I look at everything that affects human health. And of course, when you say light water magnetism, I get really interested. And I've listened to a lot of your stuff, and no, I know where you're coming from. People who are watching this, I don't believe this is very easy to understand for them. Like most people.
I don't actually care. And that's the other thing that you're going to be shocked about with me. Um, the, the problem is people need to be punched in the mouth. They need to be told the bullshit they believe. Let me just tell you something. The reason why I am resonating loudly the last 3 or 4 years on the internet, I haven't changed my message in 20 years. The problem is COVID has woken everybody up. And now people are starting to go, well, we were lied to. Everybody knows we were lied to. What else have they lied to us about? Well, guess what? We're talking about one of those things right now. In fact, this might be the biggest lie that's ever been perpetuated in the 20th century in healthcare. And part of the reason that the lie is taking foothold is because big pharma, big food, big chemicals in the Western world have actually absconded this idea so that they could use it for their benefit, basically to run a fiat money laundering scheme on 8 billion people on the planet. And they've been very successful. I will tell you that I have to give the leaders of those 3, industries high marks, because they've got most of the world believing the bullshit that you wanted to sell me in the beginning of this podcast.
I'd like to ask you about Weston A. Price, because I think if we discuss him, then your point will become very clear. So I know that the way you view most nutrition science is no one accounts for light, no one accounts for blue light more specifically. So you say that all those studies are bullshit, and of course I agree with you. Uh, but with Weston A. Price, the study he conducted was in an optimal light environment, and
Correct.
for in my understanding, what I
It
see
was
is that
also pre-supermarket, meaning that there was no processed foods. So there was no way to get avocados from Chile in Boston.
yes,
And therein lies the other part of the food story. It's the same story that I just laid out to you earlier. And, I would tell everybody listening to this podcast, if you really want to see a takedown of the Weston A. Price Foundation, you go listen to my Vermont 2016 talk on YouTube. It's an epic takedown. It was the first time ever that, this is almost 10 years ago now, that I actually told people if Weston A. Price was alive right now, he'd be a mitochondriac. He wouldn't be following Sally Fallon. Sally Fallon is one of the big people out there that makes this mistake about food. And the key is, if you go look at Price's book, which is an epic book, the thing that you'll notice, every single person that he mentions, every tribe he goes visits, they're always outside. They're not inside. What did I tell you a little while ago about the real science that Price had no idea about? You have to see AM sunlight to make your TCA cycle spin um, clockwise. In other words, you're driving everything from NADH all the way to oxygen. That's the whole point of life. That's the base biochemical level that works. That's the only way humans can use fats, and fats provide us more ATP on a per unit basis than proteins or carbohydrates. So the simple idea that Ron Rosedale pushed on the paleo community, after Weston A. Price, was that fats were the best way to go because they make 147 ATP versus glucose that makes 36. That is such a myopic and surface smooth brain way of looking at food that I can't let that kind of stuff stand. Now, the good news is Ron Rosedale has been completely obliterated um, over the last 10 years, which makes me happy. And the people who used to be my biggest critics now are actually on my side. Why? Because the things that I've been saying have actually been borne out. And that's the reason why, I actually told the Weston A. Price people in Vermont that if he was alive today, people forget he was a Canadian dentist. I used to be a dentist. I know a lot about what he knew about. I understand completely how food works. Food works as an electromagnetic barcode. That actually is what Weston A. Price's book and his life was about. The problem was his message was stolen by Sally Fallon to sell an idea that food was something different than it really was. So again, we're back to the same criticism that we started this podcast with. And what you're going to find out about me is I am going to hold people's feet to the fire. I am going to make you see food a different way. And until you see food that way, I'm not going to stop.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I'm here to learn. Uh, the thing I really wanted to ask you about Weston A. Price is that, he looked at isolated tribes and he looked at modernized tribes. And the basic gist of it is those eating, their natural diet, they didn't have any disease. Well, those who modified their diet and included modern foods, they had disease. And to my
Well,
understanding, I might be wrong.
hard stop for a minute.
I
Think about what you just said. I agree with what you said. What else didn't you realize? When they modernized their diet, did they modernize the rest of their life? They
that that's
did.
what I that's what I wanted to ask you about because I'm not sure if the light exposure changed.
It did. It brought them inside. They had more technology in their life. This is the untold story that wasn't in Weston A. Price's issue. Why? Because everybody acted like a fish when they see a lure in the water. Oh, it's got to be the food, but it wasn't. And that's the key. And the thing is, when you begin to realize this, because this is a very counterintuitive thing to understand about food, that the light environment that you eat it in actually affects how the engines in you work. Let me tell you something. That's probably my single greatest idea that I ever realized 20 years ago when I read The Monk Who Sold His Ferrari. And it wasn't an idea that actually came to me in a eureka moment. There was many things in my career that built me up to realize there was something clearly that I was missing about food that I hadn't put my finger on. It was like my Dunning-Kruger effect. But here's the funny thing. I didn't know what it was for a long time. And until I went to Florence at the foot of Michelangelo's David and looked up and I realized it right away, it was the light. I was like, holy shit. And I said, I need to really learn more about light, electrons, protons, and how it relates to food. And, what I found when I did that dive is that light is the most complex part of nature. That means that food is actually way more complex than we really think. And that is also true. Um, the problem that I have as an educator, as someone who teaches people, I have to get them off the perspective that you opened the podcast with. Why? because we will never solve the chronic disease issue if we keep the myopic focus on food. Why? Because the environment that you eat is radically changed way more than the food has. That actually is the story that's in Weston A. Price's book. That's the question you asked me. But the problem is the people who read the book, they have no earthly idea that's the truth. And the reason why they don't have an earthly idea that's the truth is because Weston A. Price didn't know it. Why? Because when he wrote the book, quantum mechanics was still being formulated. He certainly knew nothing about it. But when you go back and read his book now, which I think everybody should do, but have this perspective that I'm giving you, you will see the observations that this dentist made was spectacular. Um, he is teaching people exactly the same thing I'm teaching people now. You have to eat food that grows in your local environment at the right latitude and longitude. When you break that rule, you have huge consequences. And that means healthy food in other places in the world can be radically unhealthy where you live now. So what, people do in Philippines in the coconut farms is radically different than what people should be doing in Toronto or Boston, because coconuts can't grow there through the laws of photosynthesis.
One last question about Weston A. Price. When he visited the African tribes, he noticed that the Maasai who were drinking milk and blood, so a diet that's very heavy in animal foods, that they dominated the area and that they were taller and stronger and, more intelligent and more brave than the tribes that were more agricultural. And these agricultural tribes, to my knowledge, they weren't, they hadn't changed their lifestyle in such a way where their light viewing habits changed. And you see this example in the Swiss too. There's this tribe which had far more dental decay, but they were living the same lifestyle. But the only difference was that they drank a lot of wine. They had access to these vineyards. How do you, put those things
Well,
together?
there's a lot of things to put together there, but this is where you have to take the deep dive into quantum biology. The macronutrient people, those would be like the carnivores, the paleo guys, whomever, would want to pound on the vegetarians. I don't want to do that, because I think that is a path that leads to like misunderstanding and not comprehension. What the Maasai functionally did is the things in animal foods that matter the most, which is number one, especially in blood. Turns out that it's hemoglobin, heme products, but the big one is DHA. Your red blood cell is loaded with DHA. So if you know anything about the Maasai tribe where they live, um, DHA was not a big part of their life. Why? Because there was no marine seafood chain around it. So what did they do? They used herbivore animals to actually harvest their DHA by drinking the blood and the milk that they had. And when you begin to understand why this had a huge effect, remember, they were equatorial Africans, they were heavily melanated. This actually gave them superhuman power. This is the power that I talk about with the Sherpas. And the interesting thing about the Maasai and the Sherpas, and it goes to my original point that I made to you, that humans have the ability to be superhuman in many different environments, with this caveat: as long as the environment is native. Here's the problem. Today, 89% of people live inside. That's the latest data that we have. I personally believe that number is still too low. And when you begin to understand that, if you just mimic the diet of the Maasai, but you're on, podcasts all the time, or you're on trauma call, or, you're doing a job in Stockholm that you do, realize that what Weston A. Price found is not going to be the results you get. And that is the most counterintuitive part of this story, because Weston A. Price did not know what the effect of non-native EMF would be on the engines. He had no idea that it would disrupt the TCA cycle. He had no idea that it would change the way nitrogen enters the mitochondria. He certainly had no idea that it increased the AMPK pathways, raised blood glucose and insulin without any food at all. But guess what? Those now are axiomatic facts. We know that to be true. The problem is food gurus still don't want to talk to you about that. I keep throwing the same slides up for literally the last 20 years saying, y'all are dumb motherfuckers. And if you listen to them, you're going to get bad results. And that's effectively what's been going on for 20 years in the food world. And all I'm asking people to do, I really don't care how people eat. I just want them to know that the single most important thing about food is you got to get the environment right before you even talk about food. That's the real story of Weston A. Price that hasn't been told. And the reason it hasn't been told is because Sally Fallon, just like Big Food, is a fiat shill. She is working for money. And when you understand that this is another mechanism of basically healthcare money laundering, they're stealing time from you, then you'll begin to understand why I always say fundamentally, when you strip down a mitochondria and understand it from a biophysics perspective, it's a time machine. And that time machine gives you health span. Your analogy with the Maasai was beautiful because the reason why these people were more successful in the environment they were in, because their time machines told the best time. Their Rolexes ran better than everybody else. And when you begin to realize when they popped their cows in the side of the neck and drank their blood, those red blood cells on those cows were loaded with DHA. When you understand the work of Michael Crawford and realize what the Maasai were really doing, that was like the Maasai going fishing in the Atlantic or Pacific Ocean and
And
eating oysters. That's exactly what they did.
and that's why, I opened the podcast in that way, because the Maasai's DHA consumption, that obviously contributed a lot to their health. And that's, in the realm of nutrition. So that's why I was saying that, light is very important and nutrition is important, because without nutrition, you might become like those tribes that weren't the Maasai, that were more agricultural. So that's what I was trying to say. But I know that I think it's that if you
I'm not
don't,
going to let you have your cake and eat it too. That's what I'm telling you. Your idea that food matters is bad, and I'm going to continue to tell you it's bad. Why? Because all food is a story of light. Until you get the light story right, don't talk to me about food. Because when I come on your podcast, I'm going to keep disagreeing with you. I don't care
fine.
how you want to sell this to the public, but you're not going to use me to sell that idea.
No, no, I don't want to sell any ideas. I'm here to
But
learn.
you are.
That's it.
You've persisted 3 times so far. I'm counting.
Okay. Um, Something that many people who talk to me suffer from is digestive issues. The reason why, to a large degree, why they go to the food gurus is because they have leaky gut, they have these skin issues, and they're trying to fix everything through food. Now,
Yeah, that
of
would be
course,
the last people that you want to go to leaky gut is to a food girl. You'll never get fixed if you do that.
yeah, and that's why I want to ask you about that, because you have a very different perspective than what most people who talk about leaky gut have. So if someone came to you with, let's say, leaky gut, let's say they're underweight, they have skin issues, what would you put them on? What would you tell them to do? I'm
I have a
guessing,
member. I have a member right now that is in El Salvador here. He came from British Columbia, had horrible brain gut access problems from this gut issue. 21 years old, um, getting ready to kill himself, told all my members on a Q&A that that's how bad it was. And just so you guys know, I've got a lot of people like this. And my advice to him was get to El Salvador, take your clothes off, and get as tan as you possibly can. You'll sculpt your microbiome, your gut will get better, and all of a sudden, magically, all the ideas in your head that you want to kill yourself will go away. So, what did he do? About, I'd say it's 4 or 5 months now. Came down here. His parents gave him money. He's living with some of my older members on the beach. He no longer wants to kill himself. He now is interested in Bitcoin. He's interested in the rest of his life. He's got the best tan he's ever had because he thought he couldn't tan. And all of his problems magically went away. You want to hear the best part? Never talk to him about food, ever.
interesting.
Of course, it's interesting. You know why? Because it's how it works. And the first time that I brought this to the stage, guess what? Vermont, 2018, when the Weston A Price people invited Zach Bush, who has your perspective, has the food guru perspective, that food matters, that you need to use Restore and probiotics and all kinds of food and fermented bullshit and all that. And I got up on the stage and I said, look, there's another guy in this meeting hall right now that's done the most amazing study. His name's Jeff Leach. I said, Jeff is too nice a guy to call Zach Bush out, but I'm not. I'm going to tell you the truth. Zach didn't like what I had to say. I could care less to this day because I still think he's lying to people. Um, Jeff got on the stage and told people, he goes, what Jack's saying is true. We gave people Musketeers, Fanta, Coca-Cola, fructose, all the stuff that you could buy anywhere in the Western world. And we gave it to this tribe in equatorial Africa. And then we measured their microbiome. We actually checked their stool, and magically we found out that their microbiome didn't change because they were always outside. And then I told Jeff, I said, now I want you to leave equatorial Africa, do the same study on people in Texas where you live. And guess what you're going to find? You're going to find all the people that are train wrecks because they don't have the sun in the equatorial sun in Africa. And Jeff wrote this paper up at that time. And to his credit, the reason why I love the guy, he came from Zach Bush's mindset. He came from the Weston A. Price mindset that food really mattered. And it turned out he was the first researcher that ever showed my perspective published in literature. And I've had this belief. I'm going to tell you, it's been over 20 years. I've always known it's the light. Light sculpts everything. And when you understand why this makes total sense, it goes back to the work of Fritz Pop. Fritz Pop, when he took all living things around us, doesn't matter what domain of life it's in, he put them in photomultipliers. And one of the things that he noticed is that all things that are alive emit light. And one of the interesting things that he found is when he studied bacteria, which is what the microbiome is made out of, prokaryotes, which are bacteria, release 5,000 times more light than eukaryotes. So do a hard stop. You think that might play a role in how nature operates our gut as commensal organisms inside of our gut? Because remember, our gut is basically outside our body. It's really not inside our body. It freaks you out when you actually think about it, but your mouth to your asshole is a giant tube that connects the environment. And what's in between there is a bunch of bacteria. And it turns out that that bacteria is designed to create a light show inside of you. That's exactly what they do. And it turns out that 5,000 times more light is way more important. Then you do another hard stop. You go, why is it that vitamin D is made on our skin, but we have vitamin D receptors in our enterocytes? And we know that UVB light that makes vitamin D doesn't get there. Why is that the case? Well, guess what? It turns out the bacteria in your gut are actually what turns on and turns off those receptors. So it turns out when you really begin to understand the gut, you start to realize this is all about non-visual photoreceptors that are in our mouth to our asshole. And it turns out the light show that's going inside you is a big deal. Now, the cool part of this story is I figured out the gut before I figured out all the stuff that I've told people about in the last 2 years about melanin. Why? Because I reasoned 20 years ago that if we're making this light inside of our gut, might we be doing the same thing inside of cells as eukaryotes? Could it be a different program? And magically, 20 years ago, when people came to me with gut problems, because most people don't go to neurosurgeons with that, but they went to people like Chris Kruse, they went to Rob Wolf, they went to, all the gurus of 15 and 20 years ago. Now they go to the functional medicine guys. They come to me with a $150,000 bill of labs, and they say to me, Jack, what do I have to do to fix my gut dysbiosis, my SIBO, my this or that? Just so happens that my member, Jacob, who came to me, never went to see those. He didn't have a $150,000 bill. He just happened to be really ballsy and courageous and tell about 100 of my members on a Q&A that he was going to kill himself over this issue if something wasn't done. And I gave him the very simple answer. I said, you don't need any drugs. You don't need any food. You don't need any diet. You need an environment change. You need to go from the 45th latitude to the 13th north latitude. I said, I don't know how long it's going to take because I don't know how bad your microbiome problem is, but I promise you that probably within 6 months you'll be better. And it turns out I was inaccurate. He got better in 2.
Now, I'm really curious because I read your leaky gut protocol on your website, and I saw
Mhm.
that you recommend fermented foods, but I didn't hear you mention them now. I mean, I'm guessing
You
that
know why? The fermented food actually changes the amount of light that the microbiome makes. So guess what foods really do? They create a different light show inside of you.
yeah. So I was going to ask you about that. Bacteria, as you know, I've heard before, um, create light, and of course I heard that from you. Uh,
Well, you
so
didn't hear it from me. You heard it from Fritz Pop because Fritz Pop is the one that actually proved it in the 60s. Without
yeah,
a photomultiplier, we don't know this. Um,
yes,
Now, a lot of things that Fritz Pop said have turned out to be untrue or turned out to be used by, I would say, charlatans to obscure his message. But the bottom line is people need to know that the stimulus of food to the microbiome is actually to create a frequency of light. Those are called ultra weak biophotons. So, what's the real issue with gut issues? We need to know how certain foods create the light show. Remember what I told you in the first question you asked me? That food is really a story about light. What am I telling you again? I'm telling you exactly the same story, except now it has a little bit of a nuance to it. And the key that we're going to find in the future, and it's actually already being found out, is that when you look at the way the microbiome breaks down, the spectra that certain species of bacteria make is critical in turning on and turning off the non-visual photoreceptors that are in the gut enterocytes. And that is actually germane to actually how the gut operates. And once that process, through a process that I call quorum sensing, gets obscured, then you begin to have problems. So, how do you hit the reset button? The reset button is through sunlight. You have to see the sun every morning, and the sun needs to be on your skin. Why is the skin on your belly a really big issue? Well, that idea came 2 years ago when I sat down with Urban and Rick Rubin. Most people don't know that mammals have more POMC, which is a gene for light that is in your rectus abdominis muscle. It's one of the places in humans that we have more POMC than anywhere else. Does it make any sense why it's there? The answer is no. Did Weston A. Price know this? No. Does any of the food gurus know this right now? No. But guess what? Now you do. My members have known it for a long time. So when I tell them I want you to get your skin in the game, when you have a gut issue, it means I want from clavicles to your pubic bone in the sun as much as possible. Because what does that do? It sculpts your microbiome. You don't need Zach Bush's Restore. You don't need Zach Bush's diet. You don't need polyphenols. Now, can you eat that stuff? Will it hurt you? No, I don't think it's going to hurt you at all. Uh, may it make you better quicker? I guess that's a possibility. In my opinion, nothing has the power to change matter more than light. Why? Because it's not encumbered by mass. Food is always encumbered by mass. Therefore, it's not the top prescription for people with a leaky gut. It's always the light. And you have to get the circadian mechanism correct for gut issues. And that's the reason why AM and PM light is huge in fixing it. It's not just about the high intensity light of the sun or equatorial sun. Equatorial sun is important, for, a person who's a young man, who knows that his gut is so bad that it's destroying his brain. He wants to hurt himself. Well, that calls for emergency recommendations. Those recommendations were made for him and it worked. But if you're not suicidal and you don't have a brain gut axis issue, you may not need to go to El Salvador. You may just need to say leave Stockholm and let's say go to Tenerife or maybe the Canary Islands to fix your gut. And when you go there for 3, 4, 5 months, you may start to notice this is kind of crazy. All of a sudden, now I have a Bristol 4. I'm not shitting 9 times a day. I don't have the bloat. I'm not belching. I'm not farting. Um, all of a sudden, I'm able to think more clearly. Then you'll begin to realize that light really sculpts everything that contains matter. And that's actually fundamental to how the universe really works. That's actually the idea that's deeply buried in E equals MC squared. Energy and mass are exactly the same thing. And it turns out photons aren't encumbered by mass but matter is always encumbered by mass. Food is basically light slowed down. And when you slow light down, what does it obtain? It obtains mass. Do we know the process of that now? Yeah, it's called the Higgs boson field. When Weston A. Price was alive, he didn't know any of this. Most of the food gurus today who listen to this, they don't know any of this. But guess what? You go listen to those Vermont podcasts that I did with the Weston A. Price, you're going to hear this idea that I gave people 10 years ago. So this for me is what I'd call boilerplate. This is old school stuff. And I really enjoy taking care of people with gut problems because I actually think they're some of the easiest people to fix. The problem is most of them don't believe that they need an environmental biohack to fix the gut problem first. And this is the reason why. This is one of the few times that I'll tell you that I like functional medicine people and I like food gurus because I want those people to believe that it's calories in, calories out, and food is the dominant thing, to go to those people and waste their money. That is the punch in the mouth they get. And from the stage in Vermont in 2018, that's exactly what I told Zach Bush. I told him in no uncertain terms, all predators need prey, and you are my prey animal. You will bring many people to me, and they deserve to lose their money. Why? Because they didn't think clearly. They didn't want to think about food the way in which I asked you to think about food when we first started this. And the reason why this has, how shall we say, a teleologic advantage, humans are a very interesting mammal. They tend not to do the right things until they get the punch in the mouth. It's part of human nature that, especially when you get sick, that the answer could be standing right in front of you and you still won't choose it because guess what? Everybody else told you the propaganda lie and you believed it. The same thing is going on with COVID. And when you actually see the reason why propaganda works, I mean, it worked for Joseph Goebbels, it works for Biden, it works for people in the Western world. Propaganda is a really effective tool because it can get people to believe a lie for a really long time until one thing happens. When they get the biggest punch in the mouth. So we're kind of seeing that going on all over the world right now, both in Europe, United States, Central America. They're stealing all of our money. They're stealing our land. And people need to see truly what socialism is in their world before they get it. Now, I don't have to have this discussion with people that live in Nicaragua or Colombia, Brazil, or Venezuela. Why? Because they are further down the path where the United States, Canada, Australia, Europe are headed. Once people realize what it's like to be centralized, truly centralized, they get a punch in the mouth. And people who believe it's about fermented foods, people who believe it's about the carnivore diet, people who believe that, you can eat steaks all day, but go out and party in clubs all night, with women with big breasts and not have any consequences for that. Yeah, they need their health needs to fall apart. And that's part of the reason why I give Saladino a lot of credit. Why? I don't like particularly how he did it because it looks like he's duplicitous. But the thing that I do like is that his mind was open enough for him to say, look, I think I missed the light story. And now I'm going to go on the internet as a public guy and I'm going to tell people the truth. And, certain people are going to hate my guts for it. But then other people are going to say, and they're going to realize what Saladino did. He did what a true scientist does. New data should change your opinion. And I think when people view it from that standpoint, then you begin to realize that this is somebody you can trust. And to be honest with you, I was that person up until I was 40 years old. I believed everything that, the rest of them believe. And then it took my punch in the mouth, myself to wake up. So I really believe that wounds create our wisdom. I am a big believer that you have to believe the propaganda enough to get sick enough before you get waked up to reality or woken up to reality.
I mean, for the record, the 2016 Vermont talk, I listened to it, I believe, 4 or 5 years ago. And immediately after doing that, I thought, oh, oh, I should be in the sun more often. So what I did that summer, I believe I listened to it in late 2019, when the summer of 2020 came around. I think I tanned for like an hour every day, and I felt so good. And then, of course, I knew that everything you were talking about is correct. I knew it when I listened to you, but anyway, I just wanted to share that anecdote. And my digestion improved tremendously that year. So if anyone's a skeptic, I mean, that's just my personal experience. Um, I wanted to ask you about the cold and how that relates to nature, because I know that cold exposure is something you recommend. I don't know if you recommend it for everybody, or
Well,
not.
certain people don't need it. I mean, people that have, L0 to L3, and they live in those environments, they really don't need cold. But here's the cool part of the story. The mammalian program is still built into them. In other words, any animal on this planet that's a mammal has the leptin melanocortin magic built into them. That's really the take home message. But is cold as effective for people with tightly coupled haplotypes? No, it's not. Not only that, they don't need to do CT as much. And the proof positive in that was found, actually, believe it or not, in the US military when we put African American soldiers in Korea when it was freezing cold, and we found out that black people get frostbite faster than white people. It wasn't a racist statement. It was actually that they had tightly coupled haplotypes. Now, the problem is during the Korean War, the US military was not, smart enough to actually figure out the haplotype story. Why? Because Doug Wallace data wasn't there yet. Now everything has changed, you know, over Doug Wallace's career, 50 years. People forget 50 years ago was 1973. The Korean War was 20 years, 25 years before that. But that story now is well elucidated. And believe it or not, some of that information, now that the military has gotten it, is now trickled into NASA, and NASA's using a lot of that information to help the circadian mismatch that happens with space travel. So the reason cold is, I think, one of the coolest stories in quantum biology actually goes back to that book, The Monk Who Sold His Ferrari. And when I realized that there had to be this really unusual effect of cold on mammals, is in the book. The idea was he went to the top of the Himalaya mountains and came back really tan. So I realized that was an easy one, because when you go up in altitude, you're gaining UVB light, which gives you the tan, but you're also dropping the temperature. And that's when I realized, back from my neurosurgery days, and this is a long time ago, probably 40 years ago, that the circadian clock mechanism actually only has two stimulus that really affect it. And it turns out that it's light and dark and temperature. And when you begin to understand why nature would use temperature, you begin to see that temperature is one of the key variables through evolutionary history. I'm talking 4.6 billion years that has radically changed, back and forth, back and forth. You know, this is assuming you're not a climate change believer. Um, this means that nature inside of cells had to put a mechanism in you in order to allow you to do this. And again, when I figured this all out, uh, there was a lot of people that helped me figure it out through their work that I read in the literature. But I would say it was the Russian scientists that I read about when I translated their papers about biophotons. Some of the Japanese researchers did the same thing. But ultimately, it comes back to Fritz Popp again. And then it came back to some of the circadian researchers when I realized that nitric oxide and endothelial nitric oxide plays a huge role with like UV light and temperature variation. And I began to understand that temperature, much like light is for the microbiome, actually changes the spectrum release of biophotons. And it turns out the colder we get, the more light we make that's more powerful than the sun. So let me say that again, because this is counterintuitive for people to understand. And this is kind of the deep story that I gave to Huberman and Rick in the podcast that I did last year with them, in March. I mean, now it's over a year old. When you're in cold, most people know on Earth, if you read NASA's charts, that we get 250 nanometer to about 3100 nanometer light in terrestrial sunlight. The interesting thing is our ionosphere really filters quite well 270 down. So there's very little 250 to 270. But when you start to look at all the key proteins that are present in cells, especially the ones that are tied to the food story, all of them are in the UVC and the VUV range. Those are below 250. So when I saw like all the aromatic amino acids had absorption spectra that were down there, I started to think to myself, is the same thing that's going on with the microbiome going on inside of cells, and is somehow cold related to it? And then I got my come to Jesus moment. I'm going to say it was probably, I think it was 20 years ago, maybe 21, when I read a paper that showed that when mammals go in the cold who undergo hibernation, that it raises their dopamine levels through the roof. And I was like, well, that's interesting because dopamine is made by an aromatic amino acid. And then I started to read papers on cold and biophoton release, and I began to realize that was the stimulus. The stimulus was cold actually creates light in us that's stronger than the sun. And this makes total sense when you consider the Earth's evolutionary history. At one time, we used to have a snowball Earth. And we also know from the last extinction event, which is the KT event, that we interrupted photosynthesis, for some period of time. And I thought about that. I said, if you didn't have any food, how would you create energy from sunlight? And it turns out cold is one of the ways to do it. And what's the animal on the planet that was optimized to do that better than any other? It turns out it's the two animals that got through that event. It's theropod dinosaurs because they had mitochondria because they could fly, and then the other one was eutherian mammals. And when I began to put this together, I said cold is a really important part of actually helping people get better. And it's also an important part of why humans evolved at higher latitudes. Like when we left Africa, or I should say equatorial, because there's a big controversy whether we really have come from Africa or not right now. I don't think that controversy really matters because I think it's pretty obvious that we did come from an equatorial zone. But putting that aside, L0 through L3 migrated north, migrated south to higher latitudes. And we know that haplotypes were the biologic innovation that sculpted that ability and allowed mammals to live. So I immediately realized that mammals have a unique ability to deal with cold and still run the same programs that they run in the sun. They're just not as effective as they are in the sun. And it turned out, as we uncoupled our haplotypes, we actually became very effective at living at high latitudes. The Homo species that wasn't capable of adapting, it turns out it was Neanderthals. Why? Because they had more brain tissue and they had bigger eyes. And that's the reason why they got assimilated into Homo sapiens. That's why when we do studies on Homo sapiens now, especially people from northern European latitudes, they tend to have 1 to 3% of Neanderthal DNA in them, whereas people that are African tend not to have very much at all. In fact, they have very different haplotype lineages. And when I started to put this all together in my head, I began to realize that cold is probably one of the coolest stories in the biophysics world because it's the ultimate adaptation of life to be able to populate the rest of the globe to live at a high latitude. And mammals are absolutely expert at doing that. But when you go down this path to think this way, you realize that this is not a path that a lot of people, at least 20 years ago, traveled like I did. So I looked for a goalpost in nature that would tell me that I was going down the right path. And the number one thing that really caught me is I looked at the globe one day and I noticed that all the land masses were present mostly in the northern hemisphere, not in the southern. And Antarctica is at the pole and the Southern Ocean goes around. And I knew that the answer likely wasn't going to be in the southern hemisphere. And I looked carefully and I found the answer again, close to the food story. It was photosynthesis. Along the northern hemisphere, we have the boreal forest. The boreal forest has some unique characteristics. It makes more oxygen because it's more photosynthetically effective at high latitudes. In fact, it makes more oxygen than anything else on the planet. Some people would argue that with, some of the DHA creating creatures in the sea, but I'm talking about in the air. And when I realized that, I started to look at satellite data, and I noticed that there was a strong cutoff of the boreal forest right around the 60th latitude. So, what did that tell me about life on planet Earth? It told me that light has a limit, water has a limit, and it turns out that limit is tied to latitude and coldness. And that's when I began to look at light and cold very, very differently. I realized that they were bedfellows, they were brothers from another mother, but ultimately both of their stories came back to light. And when I found out that you could use cold to still make the key chemicals that we use in metabolism, that's when I realized the story had to be in light. So then I tore apart the biophoton literature, 20 years ago. And I found my answer, right then and there, that endothelial nitric oxide is capable of changing signaling in us. And Fritz Pop work clearly showed that we definitely made dopamine from cold. And the reason why this dopamine story is a big deal for your listeners to hear, dopamine in mammals controls skeletal muscle fiber type. So believe it or not, what does that mean? It means the colder you get, the more shredded you can become because your fiber type changes. And I thought about that and I said, God, that's not actually what happens in humans, but it is what happens in wild animals. They're in the best shape of their life when it's the cold, and humans are in the worst shape of their life. And it began to make me realize, what effectively I've become now is that humans are sculpted more by the environment than they want to know. Why? Because we've changed the light environment around us more than anything else. And see, other mammals can't do that. They don't have frontal lobes that allow them to change the environment. They have to live with it. And then I thought about the number one most common thing that people would understand about dopamine. It makes myopia. So this is the reason why all the kids in Asia have this problem with myopia, because they're all blue lit screens. It had no latitude effect at all. It actually had to do with the light. And then I started to realize, well, when you change skeletal muscle fiber type, because the muscles in the eye are actually skeletal muscles, we don't think about them that way in medicine. But when you sit down with an ophthalmologist or you go through an embryology class like I did, I was top of my class. I remembered that all the muscles inside the eye were skeletal muscles. Then I started to realize, if you aren't able to deal with light or cold properly, it would change the size and shape of your globe. And that's effectively what happens in myopia. And when people are myopic, they make less dopamine. When they make less dopamine in their eye, that means they also make less dopamine in their frontal lobes. So once the perspective happens at the retinal level, it gets transmitted through the rest of the organism. That changes signaling, changes ultra weak biophoton release. And then I began to realize this has huge impacts for other diseases. So I started to realize that if you add back light and cold at the same time, that there was a lot of these diseases that you could, renovate and fix. And that's kind of the story of cold.
The thing I was really interested in asking is, i we both agree that nature doesn't make any mistakes. And when we're in the sun, obviously, we like being in the sun. When we eat, obviously, we like eating. When we hug someone, obviously, we like hugging someone. But when we're in the cold, we seem to reject the cold very quickly. Our bodies seem
Well,
to
you
not really
you
like
do,
it.
modern humans do, because guess what? They don't live in it. But have you actually ever gone down and seen people that are adapted to the cold? Have you ever actually been to the top of the Himalaya mountains? Because guess what? They don't struggle in the cold. The people that live in Patagonia, when we first found them at the turn of the century, they don't struggle in the cold. See, this is the same idea that we started the podcast with. Because you've believed a lie long enough, and because you've experienced the lie. Remember, you're a modern human that is adapted to indoor CT from cooling mechanism, from inside your building. Mammals that live outside, for example, do you think the polar bear struggles? Does the Weddell seal struggle? Does the fox that's in, um, or the wolf that's in Yellowstone Park struggle? Does the grizzly bears in North America struggle in the cold? No, they don't. But yet you have the belief that you have. And you don't realize the reason that you believe that is because your perspective that modern humans built an environment about, I'm going to tell you, 5,000 years ago to live inside. And what's happened in that 5,000 years? We now live more inside than we ever live outside. So doesn't it stand to reason, if you understand just how a basic thermostat works, that you would have that uneasy feeling that when you go in the cold, you're not adapted to it? Now let's flip the story around. Isn't that the same thing that happens with Northern Europeans, kind of like Uncle Jack, that have freckles and white skin? When I invite them to El Salvador and they don't build the solar callus up, don't they get red and white and get blisters and they're miserable? Well, here's the funny part of the story. You have the ability as a mammal to build that ability back, but you need to know how to do it. And the problem is when you take a mammal, you know, from day 1 to day 2, because they can travel on a plane, they miss this ability. But guess what? Wildebeest, they don't miss that ability. You know why? Because they can't travel, change their latitude right away. It usually takes them several weeks to migrate. And that's the whole point of how mammal coats change, why the non-visual photoreceptors are paying attention to light and temperature. This is the reason why animals' eyes change when they go north. Most people are shocked to hear this. I actually just tweeted about this in the last week. One of the interesting things that we found from the polar explorers, meaning the humans that went up there, when humans went up and stayed up there and lived at the poles where you're not supposed to live, they lost melanin in their eyes. Almost everybody got blue eyes. So do a hard stop for a minute and then say to yourself, is this the reason why people in Scandinavia tend to have more blue eyes than they do in Africa? The answer is yeah, because guess what? They're closer to the tundra. They're closer to the area that has less sunlight. They're closer to the area of the light that turns on the POMC gene. Well, could that be the reason why the same people, when they go to equatorial environments for vacation, get red and white? The answer is you find out it's true. And when I take humans from these environments and teach them how to do and use the solar callus, they're kind of stunned. They're like, "This is the first time ever I've been able to stay in the sun 6, 7 hours a day and not get French fried, like the rest of my family is." And it's amazing to me the mistake that people make, the mistake you just made about the cold. You don't realize that your environmental adaptation is tied to two issues: light and temperature. And when you're adapted chronically over multiple generations, those programs get turned off. Doesn't mean they go away, they're not wiped out. All mammals have these programs. Thing is, you have to learn how to turn them back on.
The way I've thought about it is that um, when you do cold exposure, even if you're adapted, because I was adapted for a while, I did a lot of cold exposure 4 years ago, but I stopped because of an idea, and that idea was that if you do cold exposure, you have to heat your body up, and if you do that, you have to create a lot of energy to heat yourself up. And so I thought, oh, I'm burning a lot of calories doing this, and I was already like fairly underweight, but I was adapted to the cold. So I thought, okay, if I limit my cold exposure, I should be able to retain mass more easily, and I should,
No, it's
conserve
the
more energy.
it's actually the exact opposite. I was hoping you were going to go the right way. This is why the Sherpas can do what they do. This is the reason why you become superhuman. You don't realize when you're in the cold and you use UV light, what are you effectively doing? You're shedding mass and adding more light to the system. So this means that you're not encumbered by big muscles. Big muscles don't give you longevity. In fact, big muscles usually lead to earlier death. And the death usually is from a cardiac event or an intracranial event. And the reason why is because you're stealing energy from the two energy hogs in your body. The two energy hogs in your body are your brain and your heart. This is the fundamental reason why going to a blue lit gym and hypertrophying your muscles is about the stupidest thing you can do when you live in an artificial lit world. The smarter thing to do is what the Sherpas do. Go at high altitude where it's cold, where the UV light is strong, and what you'll find out is you shed atomic mass. Your muscles, you're still ripped because you are thin, but your strength goes through the roof. And the reason why is because what are you doing? You're actually um, making your muscles way more effective. This is the reason why when Europeans go up and they're not well adapted to the environment and they're getting ready to die from pulmonary edema, you see this little guy who's 130 pounds carry a 200-pound European off the mountain. And I've always been amazed how most of the food gurus and the nutrition gurus don't get this. Like the guy that I make fun of the most right now is probably Sean Baker in the carnivore world and probably Peter Attia in the centralized medicine world. But the guy that gets it right all the time is Erwin LaCour. Erwin LaCour has always gotten this message that your strength can actually increase even though your atomic mass goes down. So this is the reason why he's not a big believer in muscle hypertrophy. He's more about functional movement. And the way you get better functional movement is you train your central nervous system to work in nature, which is the reason why the name of his company is called MoveNat. And it's the reason why Erwin has been a friend of mine for 20 years. Like he and I got more arrows stuck in our back from the carnivore group and the paleo guys than anybody else. But he just presented with me down here to the Bukele administration in El Salvador because I told President Bukele, I said, if you want to train your military properly, I said, this is the guy to do it. He understands functionally how to make the best human mammal on the planet through exercise. And it's to connect that mammal to nature. And when you understand this, because I know what we're talking about right now, this is very counterintuitive to the dominant paradigm that's sold through, the food guru network and, the exercise guru network. They fundamentally, there's no question, they believe that hypertrophy muscles and big muscles are a great thing. It's not. It turns out strength is the most important thing. And, I've told a lot of people who've come and met me, I said, I'm not in the best shape of my life that I've ever been. I said, but come shake my hand. And when you shake my hand, you'll notice something. I'm pretty strong. And no, I don't need to go and lift and do this and do that. You get functional strength from embracing both cold and from light. And as you age, there is a reason that humans don't have big, huge muscles. We don't see Michelangelo's Davids at 85 years old. That's very uncommon. The reason why, it's not because humans don't work out. It's because you're not designed to have big muscles as you age. Why? Because this gets 20% of your cardiac output and the coronary arteries come right off on the aorta. It needs to be fed. This is where you bury your mitochondria. So when you get big muscles here, what are you doing? You're effectively stealing muscles here. You're shunting it from here and here. And this is the reason why people who are hypertrophied die. So I like to use the best modern example of this. This is the NFL player. NFL players, extreme hypertrophy of their skeletal muscle system, to do their jobs as young men. They're able to do it there, but guess what happens when they retire? Most of them are now shedding the weight. The guys who died in the 60s, 70s, and 80s from mostly brain and heart issues didn't do that. They got the benefit, from the bodybuilder guys. Oh, well, we should continue to pump iron and, eat steaks constantly to keep this weight up. Well, there's a thermodynamic cost to doing that. And the interesting thing is now when these players retire, now they're all shedding their weight. Like the best one I can think of off the top of my head is Russell Okun. Russell Okun was a left tackle in his career, one of the best ones out there. He's also a Bitcoiner. That's why I'm thinking about him. But he went from being an absolute beast to literally 3 years after he retired, I think he dropped like 75 pounds, but most of it was the muscle weight. And it makes me happy to see that these guys are beginning to get this message loud and clear. They're no longer believing, the idiots that chain at these institutes that tell them the exact opposite message. And I try to tell people that I'm not trying to tell you that muscles are bad. I'm trying to tell you that hypertrophy muscles are bad. Like I think what the Sherpas have is spectacular. If you can keep enough muscle mass to keep your strength up, that really is the story of longevity. But you need to realize in that mindset, strength is more important than hypertrophy. That's really the key.
I always explain it to people in terms of resources. If you give your muscles resources and you build them up, then you're not giving everything else resources. So absolutely, I 100% agree with you on that. And when you said, I've listened to you a lot of your stuff in preparation for this, and when you said that those with a strong heart and a strong brain, great mental acuity, are those who live the longest, or that's a predictor of longevity. I
Yep.
I agreed 100%.
Well, especially for mammals, I would just say, we're supposed to be the smartest mammal on the planet. I think when your cognitive ability drops, that's far more important than, when your muscle strength goes away. And that's not the message that's in the longevity community. And, I've told many people this on podcasts that one of my big concerns over the last 20 years is that humans now, everybody thinks that the data is correct, that humans are dying more of heart disease than neurologic disease. I no longer believe that. I haven't believed that for 10 years. I now think that neurodegeneration is the number one cause of death in humans. And it's because the environment and our beliefs are stealing from this organ. And this organ is the energy hog. This takes 20% of your cardiac output. So any decision that you make that puts cognition at jeopardy, and this maybe hopefully resonates with you because this is exactly what happens in the gut brain axis that we talked about earlier. When you have a bad gut, you're effectively forcing your brain to run on fumes and you can't think well. What people don't realize, that same mechanism happens when big muscles are present. Big muscles mimic gut diseases. And I think the reason this is very counterintuitive goes back to how we started the podcast. And to give people the science so you understand this, at least let me say it once, and then I'll shut up about it. Buried in food is a really interesting story. It's the electromagnetic barcode. That food is basically information that causes time dilation in mitochondria to decipher. So I told you before that mitochondria are time machines, but I didn't really get into the deep physics of it. Not that I want to do that for you now, but I want to explain to you, what does a longevity expert try to sell you? Tries to sell you on health span and longevity to stay away from doctors. That's a great message. But the manner in which they're doing it is actually shortening your longevity. So, what I want you to realize is that the first step in you getting this mindset right is to realize food is an electromagnetic barcode. Now, the information from food, how is the information transferred in us? Like the game of telephone in biology. The information is sent to the circadian clock mechanism that's controlled by two heme proteins. One's called Rev Herb alpha, the other one's called Rev Herb beta. And those heme proteins work on red light predominantly. They also work on UV light. And those two clock mechanisms are actually how we experience time in our life. Okay. Meaning that it can speed up or slow down. That's a consequence of Einstein's relativity. See, in Newton's world, time is absolute, it doesn't change. But we now know that Newton was wrong, Einstein is right. And it turns out we have proof in us because we found the two gears in the clock that actually speed time up and slow it down. It's Rev, Herb A, and B. So when the fidelity of the signal that comes in to make these two proteins in our clock mechanism tick with periodicity that's accurate, um, things are good. We get health span. When it doesn't tick the right way, actually time appears to speed up and we get diseases quicker and die faster than we should, even though our facades could look phenomenal. And this is probably the first time in modern human history where this kind of idea could ever be manifested. In other words, for us to see it, what am I saying to you? This American dentist and neurosurgeon is trying to tell you something that Weston A. Price told you a long time ago, that it doesn't matter what you look like. It actually matters how you experience time. And that's where health span and longevity come from. And the thing is, the things that are important in longevity are actually how accurate the periodicity of your time machines are. That is the real story of longevity. And the way in which that manifests in our world compared to, say, the worlds of yesteryear, they're going to be radically different. I think the pictures in the book that Weston A. Price showed, those were the best stories of time dilation when the environment wasn't polluted by the things we've polluted it with. Now that we have a polluted environment, I think the way in which we need to think about health span and longevity also needs to be adapted. But what's happened is the longevity and health span guys have not put what I just told you about these two clock years into their mix yet. And what I want people like you and your listeners to understand is this perspective that I have. Because I know that this perspective is counterintuitive, but I think when you examine it for yourself, you'll begin to understand that here's the coolest part of the story. Our semiconductive circuits in us can handle the level of pollution that we've given. The only thing that we need to do is we need to change our template of how we live a little bit in order to adapt. So what am I telling you? I don't think this is going to be an extinction event, for us right here, right now. It's going to be for some of us that make chronic bad decisions. But do I think that there's still enough fat on the bone with the way we're built at using our carbon-based semiconductors that are hydrated that we can adapt even to the shit environments that we've created? The answer is yeah. But the thing is, I don't want you to think that Michelangelo's David or the Greek statues that we pull out of the sea are how modern humans are going to look because of the environmental changes. The single most important thing to evaluate, I think, for a human with health span is how good their cognition and their cardiac function is as they age. And if you can maintain, a calcium index score of 0, and you can perform well on cognitive tasks, into your 60s, 70s, and 80s, I'm going to tell you that I think that your body has enough juice in it that you'll last longer than, the centralized doctors, Peter Attia or Sean Baker will tell you.
You talk a lot about latitude, and to some people, that's sort of a new idea. The thing that makes me think a lot is we're supposed to be optimized to certain latitudes. Like if you're a native Swede, you're supposed to be optimized for the 59th latitude. And if if I'm remembering correctly, your ancestry is Irish and Swedish. And so
Yeah, I'm from where you live, from the
so
59th latitude. My skin and my biology is wildly uncoupled, but
so
we have that adaptation to change it.
so my question is, you're in El Salvador.
Mm-hmm.
You understand what I mean? So you're in a different latitude, and I think
Correct.
I agree with you that it's probably much healthier to be in El Salvador than to be in the 59th latitude. But then that
No,
poses a
it's
question.
actually, I wouldn't say it's not just healthy. What am I doing? Based on what I just told you about Rev Herb alpha and beta, I'm actually allowing those two clock genes to tick with more periodicity. So what does that mean? It means as I age, as I do things that I shouldn't be doing, like taking trauma call, that I'm still able to maintain my cognitive ability and my cardiac function as I age. Turns out the boost that I can give my uncoupled haplotype and my white freckled skin is actually stronger light as I age. What am I effectively saying to you? Let's break all the science out. Let's make this very simple. Basically, Jack Kruse is a Nissan Sentra who is built for Toronto, Canada, who now battery is declining. And the only way Jack's car works in Toronto anymore is to get AAA to come put cables on the battery to jump it. The car starts, but guess what? You have to continue to do that all the time. If you don't, guess what happens? All the other systems in the car start to go south. That's what chronic Neolithic diseases are. So, if you're the Nissan Sentra and you're Jack Kruse and you look to your left and you look to your right and say, maybe what I should do is augment the battery by staying in a place where I can get electric power from light all the time, maybe then I don't have to worry about my coconut not working or my heart not working or my body falling apart because I need a hip replacement or, my bones are falling apart or whatever. You name the disease, I'm okay with it. So the idea that Jack has had over the last, I'd say probably 40 years of his life, he started out being born in New York City. Then he moved, uh, went further to Connecticut. Then he realized in his 20s, went to New Orleans to go to school. And then what did he do after that? He went back to Nashville to practice for a period of time, went back north, realized that there was a limit to that. And then what did he do? He went back to Mississippi, then back to New Orleans. Now, at 60 years old, he's in El Salvador. And through that whole time span, I would actually venture to say to you, I thought I was pretty smart from 20 to 40 years old because of what I was able to do. But looking back on it, I don't think I was as smart as I could have been. I think I'm much more smart from 40 to 60 because I realized functionally that I could augment my battery way better, really better, if I got more sunlight throughout the whole process. And the other thing that I realized is that aging is like having a bad battery. It's not a disease. Like the longevity guys want to tell you it's a disease. It's not a disease. We are designed to decline over time because we can't generate as much electric power on our inner mitochondrial membrane to run our TCA cycle. So anything you can do to augment that, just like I said with the car battery, makes sense. And why does this make evolutionary sense? Think about what I told you before. We all know that we came from L0 to L3. I mean, Nick Lane has done a lot of that work. So has Doug Wallace. The interesting thing is the story of haplotypes tell us that we can become uncoupled, less thermodynamically efficient, and still make it. The problem is that puts you at a bigger risk as you age. So this is the reason why guys like Richard Weller from your neck of the woods, 59th latitude in Scotland, is a dermatologist. And he goes, we should advocate for sun, for our patients to lower their heart disease risk. That is a great idea. I mean, it's shocking that a dermatologist can come up with that, but why is that not surprising? Because he's a dermatologist that practices at the 59th latitude and he keeps seeing all these people drop dead. And when you tell these people to block the sun that already sucks up there, they're going to die sooner. It makes sense. And that's effectively what we see. So the reverse idea is the idea that I'm sharing with you in this podcast. What if you're a native Swede and you say, okay, I'm 45 years old. My wife has breast cancer. Would it be a wise thing to do to maybe move further south where the sun is stronger so she can get an electric charge in her body that maybe she can reverse this disease without any chemotherapy or this and that? And magically, when you do stuff like that, guess what you find? You get better. And it turns out when you put this whole story together, you realize that this is really the story of evolutionary biology laid out for you, except in a decade or 2 decades in your own life. And I'll be the first one to tell you, you have to embrace paradox to really understand this. And I think it's the greatest story never told by centralized medicine because it's the story of us. And the story of us is very compelling. Um, we are the most adaptable animal on this planet, but we don't realize that that adaptation comes at a cost. It comes at a thermodynamic cost. And that cost is always paid in the biologic toll called diseases. And that's really the essence of what the chronic disease epidemic is all about everywhere in the globe. And I guess what I want people to realize is when you get that punch in the mouth from a disease, I want you to think about it differently than the food gurus or the nutrition gurus or the workout gurus are going to tell you. And I think when you realize that light is not encumbered by mass and you get in the light, that's the fastest way for you to reverse this problem. And no, you don't have to understand how the time dilation mechanism works in the mitochondria. If you want to, I'll be more than happy to explain it to you, kind of like I try to do here, because there's easy ways to explain it. But if you want to know the hardcore science, yeah, you're going to have to come to my level. And the problem is most of the experts that are out there, the food gurus, they can't explain this to you at all. You saw that when I did the Uterine podcast. You just looked, eyes glazed over. Interested. He was very interested in what I had to say, but you have to do the deep dive. And the thing that you'll find out that should make people really happy about this podcast is what I'm telling you is you don't have to be a really smart person or, um, an ivory tower researcher with a PhD or a guy with an MD or a DDS or DMD. Wild animals figure this out. Nature made this really simple for natures to do. You just have to live within nature. So if you just get the message from this podcast that all Uncle Jack's asking you to do is go live outside more than inside, get as much sun as you can. If you really get sick, try to get to a place that has better sun or better sun and cold, and do that consistently and then watch what happens. And I think when you do that, that's about the best decentralized medical advice that I could ever give anybody.
So I guess my real question is, in that case, shouldn't just people move to a place where there's more sun? Like,
Well,
shouldn't we?
you want to know the truth? I think this is a crazy, can't believe we're going to go down this road, but we might as well. I've never actually said this to anybody, but I'm going to say it to you. My belief, because of what's going on in the United States, Japan, Europe, Australia, and Canada, as money fails, everybody is going to run to the tropics. And the reason why is food and housing is going to become ridiculously expensive in those areas. Uh, Inflation is going to steal your money. So you're going to have this idea in your head very soon that if I want to live optimally and I want to have longevity, I need to go somewhere where I don't need as much food. I don't need as much shelter. Guess where that's going to be? Here, bro, take a look. That's it. See, no. See my walls? My walls are windows. And what do? I open them up. So every time in this house, I live outside in. If you look up, see that roof up there? That's got grass on top of it. So when I'm done with you, I get to go up there before I have to do some consults so that I can get more sun. Now I'm getting sun from here, just from the ambient environment, but I need to get, boosted. Why? Because I did some time dilation with you. I'm on the computer with you for a period of time, sharing these ideas, and I know that there's a thermodynamic cost to me. Now, why can I do stuff like this? As I get age, I'm in my sixth decade, because I understand the thermodynamics of what I'm trying to teach you and your audience right here. I know that for every bad thing I do, I need to do 5 or 10 things that are right so that I can keep this working and this working. Now, no illusions. No one gets off the planet alive forever. Okay. Aubrey de Grey is an idiot. He's selling you a bad idea. David Sinclair, bad idea. Longevity in humans can be extended, but I think we know what the limit is. It's probably Jean Calment, about 122 years. Now, that's if you do most things right. But even her story tells us that she did some things wrong and she was still able to persist for as long as she did. I think the biggest mistake we're making is we've built a world designed to steal our energy. See, that's exactly what I started this all with you, with the governments out there. They're stealing our time through money. That's theft. That's what inflation is. It's a taxation without legislation. What's happening now is actually even worse than that. They're adding to the inflation tax by stealing our privacy and actually stealing our time. Like the money that your parents worked their whole life is actively being stolen from. So when you realize this, and most of the world, I'd say 99% of the world hasn't realized this. The only people that have realized it, I think, is the Bitcoiners who are decentralized, which is no shock. They are going to flee to places like this. Why? Because it's cheaper to live. The money is worth more than it is anywhere else. And let's face it, this is the weather that I get 24/7. The only difference at El Salvador is we have a wet and dry season. We don't have 4 seasons. Right now, we're entering the wet season. We just came out of the dry season that was, 6.5 months long. But here's the cool part. We're always going to have water. Why? Because if you know anything about volcanism, there's tons of water under volcanoes. And we're always going to have great magnetic flux because of the volcanoes. And we're at the 13th north latitude, which means you're in the tropics. It's cheaper to live. It's gotten more expensive to live here, but it's way more expensive to live in New York City, Kona, Hawaii, Malta, Italy, where you are, Scandinavia. I mean, some of the most expensive places in the world now are in Europe. And this is all happening at the same time. So I think ultimately money is going to punch people in the mouth, and they're going to say it's too expensive to be healthy. And they're actually right when they say that. Like, I would have argued with them vehemently 10 or 15 years ago, but I think it really is expensive to be healthy. But you know what the corollary of that is? It's far more expensive to be unhealthy, especially in a world where your money and time is being stolen from you constantly by the criminals in politics. And I think ultimately when people get that punch in the mouth, because everybody's going to get that punch in the mouth at a different rate, that's when you're going to say, okay, enough's enough. You know, there is some patriotism in people that say, I want to fight, you know, for what's right in my homeland. But when you realize that the entire world is part of the same cabal that's looking to make everybody an economic slave, when you realize that it's beginning to affect your health, you have to make what I call business decisions. I made that business decision 3.5 years ago. I looked at these thermodynamic givens and I said, look, if I'm going to continue to educate the world on these ideas, I don't think the United States is going to be the best place for me to do it. Why? Because the United States has been trying to shut me up for 20 years. They make me spend $50,000 a month to avoid, the pitfalls, the legal pitfalls of spreading this message. And probably they did me the biggest favor by creating COVID, because now everybody begins to realize that the things that I've been saying for a long time are true. I just did a podcast with a guy from your neck of the woods, Daniel Prince. He's a Bitcoiner, but he's in the UK. And I told him when they banned my TED talk, I knew exactly what they were going to do. I knew that the GLP-1 drugs, the Ozempic drugs were coming. And if people learn that light, water, and magnetism, or the leptin melanocortin pathway, you could use light and cold to really treat obesity, do you think that would have affected the bottom line of the use of Ozempic? Of course it would have. But now we've got everybody believing in the world, including Europe. Just so you know, if you go in and you have obesity, the first drug you'll be given now is Ozempic. In fact, the company that makes Ozempic, you may not know this. You know that they're Scandinavian? It's called Novo Nordisk. And that's right in your neck of the woods. And they have been abusing the United States with Ozempic for about the last 5 years. But guess what? They're just started this year. If you read their stock reports, now they're going to do it in the EU. The EU now is okayed for anybody who's obese, including kids, to be on these drugs. If you don't think that this is a money laundering scheme, you're absolutely nuts. And then maybe you'll begin to ask the right questions. Is this the reason why, governments in Australia, Canada, the United States are now beginning to limit our privacy so that we can't travel to places that would be better for us? Because you know what they know? They know exactly what I just told you in this podcast. They know eventually when people get and realize that they're back in feudalism economically and everybody is a slave on the plantation picking cotton, that they're going to have to stop you from coming here. And the most ironic part of this, I don't even think people realize why the southern border of the United States is open. They have to let these people in because they need those people to run the economy, because Americans are too broken down to run their own economy. They're train wrecks. And they're train wrecks because of their addiction to blue light and technology. And the sad part is the people that were in the best places in the world, Central and South America, are running to the United States. It's like running towards the Titanic at exactly the wrong time. And the smartest people, the people that I think what's going to happen in the next 10 years, there's going to be people climbing over the wall in Mexico to run down to El Salvador. And only the people fit enough that can climb the wall are going to get over. And when I say fit, I'm not talking physically. It's going to be the people that realize they're going to have to realize how the government has hamstrung them from traveling, because that's exactly what's happening in Canada. I'm sure you just saw some of the stuff in the EU and Canada when people went in to get their money out of the bank and they said, well, we're going to do this and do that. And the bank said, no, you're not going to do it. Do you fundamentally understand why the bank is not giving you your money? Because they want to make sure you stay in the country where you're a slave. They want to make sure that you pay all your taxes that you need to pay for the debt that the politicians stole from you. You are now picking their cotton. That's what you're doing. And they're not going to let you leave. And this is one of the big ethoses in Bitcoin that we say that if you don't custody your own Bitcoin, you don't own it. Well, here's the fucking real wake up call for people all over the world that persisted in this podcast to this long. Turns out it's the same thing is true at fiat. If you don't custody your own money, um, you don't own it. And if you want to know the truth, everybody listen to this podcast, if you're wise, go to the bank and take all your money out slowly over time and keep it in your mattress. Why? Makes no sense to keep it in the bank anymore. Why? Because you don't get any interest anyway. So what are you keeping it there for? Because when you do keep it there, they're telling you can only have it as they dole it out to you. And what's the story that they hide this in? It's AML and KYC laws. What does that mean for your audience members? Because this is really where health and wealth are fundamentally linked. AML is anti-money laundering laws. The other one is KYC, which is know your customer. This is a ruse like climate change that we need to protect you from criminals who are using money. It turns out the fucking criminals that are doing this are your politicians. They are making sure that you can't travel down here when you finally get the punch in the mouth that I'm trying to give you in this podcast so that you can come down here and get recharged up. Because God forbid, the worst thing that you could ever become for your government is smart. See, keeping you dumbed down makes you controllable. Lowering your dopamine level is the ultimate goal of the World Economic Forum. It was the ultimate goal of COVID. COVID was a compliance test for an economic reset that's coming. You're all getting ready to be slaves. You're not going to be able to come see Uncle Jack in El Salvador. In case you don't know that. 10 years? Bro, you're going to be in Stockholm. You're going to be paying for all the stuff that the politicians over there did. It's even worse in places like Germany. And remember, every zip code in the EU will be different. I'm not saying everybody is going to affect or have the same effect. Right now, the biggest prisons in the world are probably Australia and Canada. Probably the least big prison for the people is El Salvador. Why? Because the government is returning freedoms while the rest of the world is taking them away. And it just so happens that this biologic story fits right into it. Why? Health and wealth are fundamentally linked. And it turns out you will be healthy in the future economy because you're wealthy. Why? Because you can buy the freedom to have sun. You can buy the freedom to have water. You can buy the freedom to have magnetism. In all the other places, right now, you have the illusion of that freedom.
Speaking of low dopamine levels, you just reminded me of something, and I really want to ask this since men struggle with it, and you're a neurosurgeon, you know a lot about the brain. All men are practically speaking addicted to porn, and they also, well, in my opinion, oh no,
I don't watch porn at all. I actually see no point of it.
yeah, I mean
But
that's
do I agree with what you're saying that your generation is addicted to porn? Absolutely. You have no interest in sex because you all have pregnenolone steal syndrome. But how did you get that? From screens. So that's no shock to me. So what you said, directionally accurate, but you generalized it. You made the same mistake the food gurus make. And I have to stop you on that. Why? Because no, not all men. I think all men who are not blue light addicted, we don't have any problem avoiding porn. Porn is absolutely fucking useless to a mitochondriac.
I was going to say that. I was going to link it to what you've said about musicians. Since
Mhm.
screens emit blue light, and you've said that blue light makes you, you know, it messes up your brain, you'll need some kind of stimulus. So that's why musicians who have concerts late at night, they take a bunch of drugs. So I was going to link porn addiction and let's say masturbation addiction to blue light and
Well,
ask
there's
you
no question, but I would even tell you it goes deeper than that. Some of the stuff that hit the podcast editing floor with Rick and Uberman was the gender identity stuff. I will tell you, the more blue lit and more non-native EMF you have, the more gender identity issues you're going to have. And the reason why, it turns out, light controls the sex steroid hormones. Like this isn't like how shall we say, an ethnic or racist or I don't even know what you would call it, like some kind of ideology against a group of people. No, it's fucking basic biology. I mean, there's papers out there that show that light leads to changes for precocious puberty. We know that the children who are blue light toxic, they become, they have earlier periods. They develop much faster than they normally would. It has direct effects on your pituitary gland. So it's no shock that these things are happening. But here's the funny part: the politicians are using the ideology against you to see this story. Remember what I told you literally a little while ago. They want to keep you dumbed down just enough so that you never ask the real question, like, why the fuck am I living in Stockholm when I have dark skin? This makes no sense at all. I should be living somewhere else. Well, if you make that decision, that means that you take all your value, all your money out of the bank, and you go somewhere else. You're not useful to them. Just the same reason that pharmaceutical companies are not in the business of healing you. They want to keep you a customer as long as possible. Governments are the same way. They want to keep their populations as long as possible because they dumb you down and harvest your blood. Your blood is your time. It's exactly the same story the Maasai are doing with their cows, except they treat their cows nicer than the governments treat us.
Jack, I want to ask you about gaining weight because, again, many of the people that I talk to struggle with that. And generally speaking, the things you talk about, because, again, the people who come to you probably have those issues. Um, you talk about neurodegeneration, psychiatric disorders, diabetes, and people who are fat. But
Mm-hmm.
what would you do with someone who's struggling to gain weight? Is it just sun, a bunch of sun again, and
No,
they'll
it's actually you. It's not. That's not the issue. You actually frame this the wrong way. It's kind of funny. The guy that I told you earlier about that was going to kill himself, Jacob. Um, he struggled with weight too, and I told him you are not going to add the appropriate mass on when you have this light mismatch going on in your body. Eventually, what's going to happen? Your strength is going to rise, even though your mass is small, and then you'll find out that your body will find its equilibrium based on the environment you're in. So, people that are really struggling with increasing their mass also have a light problem. Like people don't realize that anorexia and obesity are almost the exact same thing, but because of the way the mechanism is caused. But the real difference is that light is behind it, and it turns out light is different. How do we see this in other diseases? I want to make this really interesting for the audience. This is the reason why, if you think about the United States is loaded with type 2 diabetics who are fat. But what people get stunned when I tell them is the number one place that diabetics is growing faster than the United States is in India. And in India, the diabetics are different because they're skinny. They're type 2 diabetics, but they're skinny. And when you realize that the reason this is happening is because they imported technology about 25, 30 years ago, that's why all the Google and Meta call centers are there in a highly densely populated area, and people that are basically vegetarian or vegan, uh, and who wear sheets over their skin constantly, you begin to see, well, this is an interesting story. They're all getting diabetic. It's a light story, but they're not becoming fat diabetics. Well, it turns out the latitude of these areas in India where this is happening, because this is southern India down by the tip, or Bangalore is, America is at a much higher latitude. The lowest latitude in America is 20, but that's in Hawaii. And that's not most of the United States. The lowest part of the United States is 24 at Key West. Continental United States is much higher. And the only part of the United States um, that is really subtropical is the bottom part of it. And if you go look at N. Haynes data, it turns out there's not a lot of diabetics in the United States at the 24th to 28th latitude. You know where most of them are? Above the 28th latitude. And it turns out the cities that have the biggest problems are the ones that are cities that people are using electromagnetic radiation the longest, when they have poor UV. And it turns out the poor UV is the real key for you getting fat. It goes back to the Fritz Pop story. The people in southern India have pretty good UV. They still get diabetic, but they don't become fat. So when you begin to realize that fatness really is a problem of blue light, um, and blue light to an excess. And not only that, to get really morbidly obese, not only do you have to have blue light during the day, but you also have to have blue light during night. That's actually how you get the fattest. So in the United States, the real problem with obesity is the people that are doing shift work. Shift work people have a huge problem with obesity. If you're living indoors, like say you're living behind the windows, people don't realize that the latest data 89% of humans in the United States live inside. Oh, you don't realize that the glass here blocks all the UV, blocks 40 to 60% of the red. So it should be no shock why that's an issue. How do all of us work? Do most of us work outside or inside? Inside. What does technology fundamentally do? What's its real problem? It draws us inside because people are plugging it into the power grid. Very few people are doing what I'm doing, that talking to you outside on technology. It's not something that offices are built for. And then when you think about the lights are above are LEDs. Remember, the government's all got rid of the incandescents that actually gave you some UV. And they said, oh, because we're trying to save the climate, which is more bullshit. They're actually just trying to dumb you down and make you more of an obedient idiot. Everything is designed to keep people inside these days. And then when you get inside, remember the screens, there's not a single computer company, with the exception of the one I'm involved with, which is the Daylight Computer, that makes computer screens that have no blue light in it. Well, why is that? Because blue light addicts you to their technology. It also makes you fat. So the single number one thing for you to do is to limit your blue light exposure during the day and at night. And you need to do both. And you need to use every strategy you can. Some of the things that you've talked about already, like going in cold, that helps you shred for sure. But blue light is a huge problem. Now, if you're obese and you said to me, I would like to change my diet and eat more ketogenic, that's great. But I want you to hear what I said to you earlier in this podcast. The ketogenic diet only works when you see the sunrise every morning. Why? You cannot fat burn without AM sunrise. I got news to you. Every single fucking fat person out there never see the sunrise.
Jack,
Ever.
Jack, I was actually, talking about the people who have a problem gaining weight. What should they do? What's
Sun.
the
Anorexia is a story of sun. Usually their problem is they don't have enough UV light. They don't have enough infrared A light. They need to operate all their cytochrome proteins on their intermitochondrial membrane so they optimize apoptosis and autophagy. That's their real problem. And when you do that, you'll fix the hormone panel that controls that. The number one thing that controls that is IGF-1 axis. And when you control IGF-1, you'll start to see it rise. And when it rises, it'll rise enough so that you're able to keep the mass on that you need. But generally, it's a deficiency in sunlight.
yeah, it seems like everything is a deficiency of sunlight. Um,
Oh no, it's not really. It can be a deficiency in sunlight. I just try to give you that nuance that between the skinny and fat diabetics in the United States. That's why I went down that path for you, because that's not true what you just said. It sounds like that to you, but you need to be more nuanced than that. If you replace the sun with blue light, you have a problem. You have to realize that full spectrum sunlight contains all seven frequencies and different amounts. And it turns out that the way we've built our modern world has subtracted out the purple and the red to different degrees. And how you've subtracted out the purple and red leads to the diseases you get.
you've mentioned Bitcoin a lot, and I'd like to ask, I mean, yes, it's volatile. It
It's not volatile.
it's not
Again,
okay.
you're spreading nonsense that you've heard about it. Just so you know, when Bitcoin started in 2011, it is the most dominant asset on the planet. Nothing, including Nvidia, Google, or Facebook, have produced more gains for the people who have owned it. That's not volatility.
Now,
Okay.
what I wanted to say is that people say that it's
I know what you were
volatile.
going to say, but it's incorrect. It's incorrect.
No, I'm going
You're
to
worried
say
about this.
no.
You're
I'm
worried about this.
oh no, Jack. I was going to say that no. I actually think it's a great idea, and I think a decentralized economics is the future. And so my question was going to be, what would your advice be to someone who wants to get into it? What should I?
I actually
But
told you the answer already, but you didn't listen to me. Go to the bank, start taking all your money out and converting it to Bitcoin. That's exactly what you should do. If you live in Europe where you are, you're already way behind big time. And just so you know, everybody in the EU right now is trying to take your privacy away. As soon as you go and take the money out, they're going to want to know what you're going to do with it. Never tell them what you're going to do with it, ever. Okay. And you need to self custody all your money, all of it. You don't let anybody else know where it is. That's what you need to do. That's how you store your energy that you use to work in your whole life. And you need to get through this period of where politicians thinks it's a good idea to steal our money from us, because that's effectively what fiat money is being used for. They are taking our money away at record rates. And the goal is so that you become easily controlled. That's what the whole one world government idea is about. So right now, people in Europe are being limited to how they can even buy Bitcoin. So how I buy it compared to how you buy it is radically different. This is the exact same story that I told you about food. How food works, totally different in different environments. Like you come to El Salvador, no one's going to stop you from buying Bitcoin. Why? Because it's legal tender here. Um, in the United States, we have a senator named Senator Elizabeth Warren from Massachusetts. She basically is a proxy for the banking institution. She's trying everything possible to break down the Fourth Amendment in the United States, which is the privacy law. If you fundamentally, I don't care what country you're going to listen to this podcast in, if you fundamentally don't believe that when you go to work, that the money that you make, you should be able to buy whatever the fuck you want, then you're an idiot. It's as simple as that. What does Bitcoin do? That's exactly what it allows you to do. It allows you to store that monetary energy no matter what over periods of time, so that when your money devalues and it goes down, which is what it's been doing for literally 5,000 years, that no government can take it away from you. They're eventually going to take, in Europe, what's going to happen probably in the next 2 years, you're going to have a money confiscation event, and they're going to turn around and say, we're going to give you a central bank digital coin. And the only way, this is going to be programmable money. And they're going to say to you, you know what? You've done too many podcasts with Jack Kruse. So therefore, we're not going to allow you to travel to El Salvador. And they're going to turn your money off when you're at the airport to buy a ticket. That's effectively what's going to happen. They are going to make decisions for you because they control the money. That's what a centralized institution does. So let me flip this around. Say if I want to come see you in Stockholm and I'm down here in El Salvador, I can get on a plane. Nobody's going to fucking tell me anything. They can't. They have no idea what I'm doing. Okay. It gives you ultimate freedom to do what you want. That is the whole point of why Bukele centralized the money. And the reason he did it is because after the civil wars here in El Salvador, 20, 25 years ago, their own money collapsed. They've been using American money since that time. So the other dual legal tender status here in El Salvador is American money. What's the problem that Bukele faced when he became president in 2019? He knows the economics of the world is falling apart. So he's concerned that his poor voters, his constituents, could get killed by decisions made by the US Fed. So he needs a backstop for his people. Most people don't even realize that the first decision, big decision, that Bukele ever made wasn't, getting the bad hombres and putting them in jail. He actually made Bitcoin legal tender first. Why? Because he was concerned that the US banking situation was so tenuous that it could go boom. And if it goes boom, his people are screwed because they rely on US money. The funny thing is, people in Europe don't even realize they rely on US money through the Eurodollar market. And most of you don't get it. That's the reason why I told you. I already gave you the answer. The fact that you're asking me this question tells me that you don't understand the decentralized network in money, which is Bitcoin.
that's exactly why I'm asking you.
And what does it effectively do? It allows you to have time control of your money. Just so, again, the analogy I gave you with Rev, Herb, Alpha, and Beta, I'm going to give you in Bitcoin right now, so you understand why Bitcoin is a time machine as well, just like your mitochondria is. One tick of the internal clock of Bitcoin corresponds to 10 Earth minutes. Okay. That's a large enough time window to find consensus when you buy something. So even if the communication in the Bitcoin network is slow or unreliable, it still operates on a 10-minute interval. In other words, it gives it a periodicity that always happens. It turns out that light that's captured in chlorophyll, hemoglobin, and cholesterol slows light down from the sun tremendously, so that a small moment of time dilation, allows for food creation, food to manifest. It's exactly the same idea. And that's why the guy that came up with Bitcoin, the pseudonymous Satoshi Nakamoto, I fundamentally believe that not only had he be a student of economics, but he also had to understand circadian biology, the basics, because he realized that if you're going to create the ultimate form of money, what we call hard money that the governments can't steal, it has to be valuable in time and not in energy. Why? Because you can always find more energy and make more money. Just the same way you can go find and dig more gold, you know, somewhere around a volcano in Scandinavia, or like the Norwegians can become richer if they just drill for more oil. That's what their krona is based on up there. And that's the reason why they're the richest country in Scandinavia. It's about the natural resource, the proof of work behind it. Well, proof of work works in nature. Proof of work in nature is light and dark cycles with temperature. Um, and it turns out in Bitcoin, proof of work is the electric power that strengthens the network so that it's extremely accurate. And the best part of Bitcoin, it has a fixed supply. So, in other words, governments can't print more of it. And if you self custody your Bitcoin, no one can steal it from you. But see, that's exactly what's happening in Stockholm right now. If you go to the bank, or I'm sure the banks are closed now. I don't know what the time difference between you and I are, but right now it's about 9 a.m. where I am. So it's
Five.
probably about 3 or 4 where you are.
No, it's an 8 hour difference, so
All right.
it's approaching
So
5.
so the banks are now closed. You couldn't even go out and take your money out to actually buy the Bitcoin if you wanted to. But my advice to you is that everybody who listens to this podcast, if you're interested in the biology side that we laid out, you need to become interested in the Bitcoin side, because the Bitcoin side is going to get you to El Salvador. Like when you get your cancer, you get your autoimmune condition, you get your anorexia, you get whatever disease you want to come up with. Ultimately, you're going to try to fix it in your home country. I get that. You're going to employ the regular doctors that your high taxes pay for. You're going to find out that talking to those doctors is like talking to a wall. You're not going to get better. And then functionally, after you get the punch in the mouth, you're sicker than shit. You're going to listen to this podcast 2, 3 years from now and go, okay, I want to go to El Salvador. And then you're going to find out they're blocking you from going. Then you're going to realize, okay, I should have bought some of that Bitcoin, because back when this podcast was out, it was at 60,000 a share. Now it's at 400,000. I would actually have plenty of money, because the flight from Stockholm to El Salvador, probably, let's say 3 or 4 years from now, in economy, it'll be about 10,000 bucks in your money.
In
But
my
in Bitcoin, it'll be about $200 in Bitcoin.
You mean $10,000?
Yes, easily.
Holy moly. Okay, I
That's
better
how
go
that's
there
how they're gonna.
quickly.
Oh yeah, that's how. Well, it's already happened. I mean, just go look. Let me ask you a question. Just this is a simple question. Is the prices of houses more or less in Stockholm from 4 years ago to now?
No, they're probably more now.
Okay. Do you know why they're more? Not
Mm,
because the money's worth anything. It's because the money's worth less.
yeah, right. It's
Remember, a
inflation.
house, yeah, it's all about inflation. Who controls that?
Government?
Politicians, right? How did the politicians do it? It's not through legislation, through taxes. It's through spending money they don't have. Got it?
Yeah.
So these people are making decisions for you on your behalf. That is centralization. That is how centralized politics steals from their taxpayers. And the problem is they are banking on you not waking up to this issue. That's the reason I'm telling you right now. What is the impetus to putting your money in the bank? Like, what did your grandmother tell you? Well, if you put your money in your bank, you get 5% interest, you gain money, you won't lose it, you're fine. Is that true in Stockholm right now? No, you have negative interest rates. That means when you put $100,000 in, the bank is going to tell you in 5 years, we'll give you 95,000 back. Does that make any sense to you? And then when you go in the bank to try to take some of the money out, what do they say to you? Oh, you want to go to El Salvador? Sorry, we're not going to give you money to do that.
Interesting.
That's what's going on, bro. That's exactly what I just told you. This is not conspiracy theory. You can go on Twitter right now and find out that Uncle Jack is telling you the truth. But you know what the problem is? This is not well known. Just like the first thing that we talked about, that food is an electromagnetic barcode isn't well known, or that mitochondria are time machines, or how the leptin melanocortin pathway works on light and dark and cooling and heat. This is the whole point of this podcast, that you need to decentralize your life. Like the vaccine that we all need anywhere is we need decentralization. I want you to decentralize your biology with nature, and I want you to decentralize your monetary system with Bitcoin. It has nothing to do with the government, it has to do with you. This is an N=1 decision, because when you inject decentralization, you get freedom from disease, or freedom to do whatever you want. And eventually, I think, because we're all addicted to things that harm us, you're eventually going to need to come here and recharge your battery. And I want you to be able to have the ability to do that, because soon you're not going to have the ability to do that. You're going to go see the doctors in Stockholm. You're going to go see the doctors in Europe, and they're going to have nothing in their armamentarium that can help you. All they're going to do is keep selling you big pharma, not big pharma, big pharma solutions from Novo Nordisk for your problems. And all that's going to do is institutionalize you further, continue to make you a patient so that they can keep harvesting you. This is money laundering. That's exactly what it is. They are stealing time from you. And you need to understand this in very basic terms. Once you do understand it in very basic terms, this is the point that I'll make to you. Maybe we end on this. Once you begin to see what I'm trying to show you in this podcast, I may have pissed you off in the first 2 hours of it, but you're going to see there's some magic in what I'm trying to teach you. And those magics are going to keep you healthy, wealthy, and alive, free. You're going to be a wild human. You're going to be a wild mammal. You're going to like me a lot more than you did when you first met me, because you're going to realize what I'm trying to teach you. I am trying to teach you to be ungovernable. Ungovernable for diseases and ungovernable for your politicians. That's exactly what I'm trying to do.
Thank you, Jack.